Welcome back, everybody. You're listening to Cut the Shit, a podcast series that aims to take a closer look at the impact of the IT industry, both the good and the bad. Cut the Shit is brought to you by Plow Networks, a managed IT services company based just outside Nashville, Tennessee. I'm Bryan Link, EVP of Products and Services here at Plow, and I'll be your host for this series. I'll ask questions, and with the help of our guests, try to dig deep on some of the key challenges we all face dealing with IT. So with that, let's cut the shit and get started. On today's episode, I'm very excited to have Dr. John Petrocelli as our guest. John is a professor of psychology at Wake Forest University, my business school alma mater, Go Deeks, where he has worked since receiving his PhD from Indiana in 2007. John is a social psychologist who specializes in the study of judgment and decision-making, counterfactual thinking, and most critical for our discussion today, the concept of bullshitting as a social behavior. He's even written a book for the general public called The Life-Changing Science of Detecting Bullshit, and I can't recommend it enough. Now, you might be surprised to learn that bullshitting is a subject of serious academic study, but as John and I dig deep into the subject matter, I think you'll see why what he's doing is such a fertile and important area for psychological research. I hope you find the insights he shares as interesting and relevant as I did. Bottom line, bullshit doesn't just exist in politics and sales. It's everywhere, so we all need to be able to recognize it and deal with it. I hope you enjoy my conversation with John Petrocelli. Hi, John. Welcome to Cut the Shit. How are you today?
Great. Thanks for having me, Bryan.
So where are you today?
I'm at my office on Wake Forest University campus. The semester has just started, so.
Perfect. So you're literally about 8 miles away from me, I think, given where my house sits. So,
okay.
I guess we'll say that's down the street. It's not, it's a long street, or it's a bit of an interstate, but it's not far. So, it's nice to have somebody close by. I guess we could have done this face to face, but let's face it, this makes things real simple. You can jump out of your day and I can jump out of mine, and we can do this thing. So thanks again for joining me.
Sure thing.
I've asked this question to a variety of folks, just given the kind of on the back end of COVID and the sort of the travel shutdown people experience for a good bit of time. Have you been traveling much lately? And if so, have you gone anywhere interesting or fun?
Actually, it hasn't affected my travel at all. I'm actually more introverted than I ever thought I was before March of 2020. So it hasn't really affected me much. But my travel the past year has been pretty normal. I was in Manhattan a couple of weeks ago. Before that was in New Orleans. Before that was in Chicago.
So here and there. So you've been around.
Pretty much here and there, everywhere. I'm glad things are getting back to normal.
Yeah, I was in New York in mid-July, so just over a month ago, and I was, particularly in Midtown, I was really struck by how much vacancy I saw in terms of space available. I couldn't tell if that was like traditional commercial or commercial retail, but it was a little bit shocking. There were lots and lots of people, so it wasn't. It didn't seem to foot traffic seemed to be fine, but there certainly that felt like an overhang from the shutdowns for sure, or at least the lack of traffic there for a period of time. So,
well, I learned quickly why in New York there was such an outbreak of COVID in sort of the beginning months, because coming back on the subway from the Yankee game on a Thursday night,
it's not just body to body; it's nose to nose. Yeah,
pretty much.
Yeah. Yeah, you get up close and personal with millions of people you didn't know were your best friends, and that's sort of the day-to-day existence for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I'm from Pittsburgh, so I'm a Pirates fan, and I've never witnessed that many people on a Thursday night game, but I guess in New York.
Yeah, they've got. I'll give them credit. They got a great baseball fan. Rooting for them. Due respect to those who do, but it's sort of like it's like rooting for the corporate America or something. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but it's hard to feel too sorry for the Yankees fans when they lose. It hadn't been very much of a rough go in general. So that's for sure. Well, one last kind of question before we sort of jump in, and that's you've been you've been teaching for a while and you've had a bunch of experience in the classroom, and then you've also had, whether you wanted it or not, lots of experience with online education over the past year plus, or at least more than maybe you had before. Can you tell us about an interesting use of technology or a hack that you witnessed either from a colleague or from a student, something that you found interesting that you know, kind of caught you off guard?
Well, the thing that surprised me most, I don't think I will go back. So obviously meetings on Zoom and classes in Zoom were very common. At the very beginning of the shutdown, and then the semester following. But the surprise that I found was meetings with Zoom with maybe 4 or 5 students. I found that those meetings are so much more productive. For whatever reason, I find Zoom meetings, people are more prepared. They have more clear questions. We just get much more done.
Do you have a theory on why maybe?
Well, the ability to access information straight from the same screen that you're watching other people, and so perhaps maybe their access to the web or whatever documents they might be working on together, if it's a team oriented kind of task. Other than that, I'm not really sure. I mean, perhaps people are feeling, well, actually people are looking at me, and there's maybe a bit of a spotlight effect.
Right.
And so there's more, maybe perhaps more accountability. And I just find if I have a meeting with 1 or 5 students in my office or after class, it's just not nearly as productive. And so I prefer to have meetings with 4 or 5 students on Zoom now than I do in person.
So that's a change for sure then,
yes,
than
yeah,
before.
but all students actually prefer courses in person, and
Right.
so do I. But
Right.
as far as meetings go, I think it's much more productive to do it on Zoom.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, I think we're not even in the first inning. Like we're just getting to. I think we're still in batting practice or like taking infield. Like we haven't even gotten into the game yet for understanding remote / hybrid, work and that mix of face to face versus online and how best to do that. So I think that's probably a fair statement to make. Kind of writ large, whether that's education or business or whatever.
Yes, and many of the phone calls or otherwise phone calls have often been upgraded to Zoom calls now, and and that's fine. You at least get to see each other, and
Yeah.
that works. So I don't do many phone calls. I do a lot of FaceTime and Zooming now for
Right.
just about every call that I would have otherwise had on the phone.
Yeah, makes sense. It makes sense. All right, well, let's kind of jump in. Let's get to the main event. To get us started, you mentioned you're at Wake Forest. You're a professor there. Give us a quick thumbnail sketch on your background and how you got started as an academic / researcher.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I've been professor of psychology at Wake Forest University this is my 16th year now, and I teach social psychology courses, mainly upper level. Junior and senior level courses in psychology, social psychology, and judgment and decision making courses, and that's where my background is, in social psychology, judgment and decision making. And I think I stumbled into the career. At first, I thought I wanted to help people, and be a counselor and a clinician.
So you started off in that direction.
Yes, yeah, I was more than halfway through a PhD in counseling psychology before I came to my senses and and realized I was much more of a researcher and writer than I wanted to be in the clinical arena. And so I switched specializations to social psychology, and I made the right decision, because it's just the field is really wide open with so many rich ideas, and the focus on experimental psychology within social psychology is really where it's at. I think that gives us the best answers to the research questions that we have. So a popular question in social psychology is which persuasive technique works best for this person under these circumstances and these conditions. How do we get attitudes to change? What's the relationship between attitudes and behavior? I mean, that's a classic social psychological question, persuasion and influence. And I just became fascinated with it, and the tie-in with experimental approaches to it. So it's not just my theoretical perspective or my own personal opinion about what works. I have to test, through an experiment, whether or not the technique works. And I just have a lot more respect for that approach than your armchair Monday morning quarterbacking on what actually works. I just think that's much more useful to the world than just my ideas.
Well, I think that's a nice I think lead in to sort of the topic at hand today, and we'll talk some about your book, but I also think the applicability of that in the business world, because again, this is a podcast. It's a business focused podcast, right? We talk about we're in the information technology world, but we often get into broader topics because whether you're a manager or an individual contributor in a technology business or a manufacturing business or a services business, at the end of the day, a lot of these kinds of things cut across, right? How do you make good decisions? How do you decide, what's true? I don't know about capital T true, but true as far as we know it within the context of the scientific method and some of those things. So we'll definitely get into that as we dig. So first, congratulations on making that pivot before you got, because it can be tough in academia. You can get too far down a path, and oftentimes it's tough. And it sounds like, I know from our previous conversation, you paid a little bit of a price for that decision in terms of your time to the job market and some of that. In fact, if I remember correctly, your mom or dad gave you a hard time about were you ever going to actually get out of school and get a job or something along those lines, if I remember correctly.
Everyone, including some of my advisors, told me not to do it. Just finish.
Right.
And
you're too far down the path. Keep going. Don't stop. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And being a graduate student for 10 years is not recommended. Certainly not financially either. So
yeah, those stipends are really, you can really heavy duty fund your 401k there with that. So
yes,
yeah.
but I made the right decision in the end, I think.
Oh, that's great. Well, so tell us a little bit about, you've mentioned some general kind of aspects of social psychology and some of the things you're focused on. Tell us about your current research focus. Let's drill down a little bit. And this isn't a G-rated podcast, so feel free to use the terminology as you do in your current work.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So my main focus today is the behavior of bullshitting and trying to understand the social behavior to better position ourselves, give us a better vantage point to better detect bullshit and dispose of it properly. And so I had done the first half of my career, I focused primarily on counterfactual thinking. So your would have, could have, if only thoughts that we mentally run through our minds and mentally simulate and sort of play out the consequences. If only I had worn my red sweater, I didn't know that was her favorite color. If only I'd worn my red sweater and my green sweater, I probably would have gotten her number and she would have gone out. That kind of thinking, always playing into some better reality than actually occurred. And I had a lot of data that I was looking at that considered the relationship between counterfactual thoughts, learning, memory, and decision making. And I had treasure troves of data that really didn't make much sense. And it dawned on me after reading so many of the written examples that people were bullshitting themselves quite a bit.
Yeah, I want to stop right there because you just made you used a phrase that I think is important to get out front right now, and that's, you said people are bullshitting themselves, right? And that we tend to, and I think this discussion will cover a couple of different angles. But before we get too far, I want to make sure that the audience understands we're not just talking about other people bullshitting you, although that's part of it. It can be just as problematic in you bullshitting yourself, if I understand correctly.
Yes, actually, the biggest bullshitter that we will expose ourselves to often is the self. We certainly get it from all sources and from every angles. And what I mean specifically about the substance of bullshit is one in which it occurs when people communicate something either consciously or unconsciously, intentionally or unintentionally. They communicate something that has no connection, no regard for truth, genuine evidence, or established knowledge. So the behavior of bullshitting often comes out in a very broad array of rhetorical strategies, all designed to help us sound like we know what we're talking about. And they're often used when we want to impress others, or we want to influence, persuade others, embellish something, or just simply sound like we know what we're talking about.
Right. And that last one feels very, very, I think ubiquitous, right? The idea of making sure, we all want to feel like we know what we're talking about, right? I think that's tough. Before we get too far, because I sort of cut you off, you were talking about the kind of the first half of your career was not focused on bullshitting. You kind of you sort of got there. What was the spark? What was the transition point from the earlier research into the sort of, it's not necessarily a new line, but it sounds like maybe an application of some of the earlier work?
Yeah, well, I was looking for an explanation for why the data didn't make sense. And it seemed as though no matter what the outcome, the actual outcome for an individual was, I could have gotten an A on an exam, but I got the B plus, and here's why. If I did this, and no matter what the case was, participants in my studies often seemed to think that they had an entitlement to a desirable outcome. No matter if they had just thought about the situation long enough, they deliberated long enough, that they would make the right decision. There never seemed to be an entertainment of the possibility that maybe it's just not in the cards for you.
Right.
You would have never gotten that number, Bryan, and you never would have had an A, no matter how long you studied. And those are possibilities, but that was never really entertained. And so earlier research suggested that, well, counterfactual thinking, it helps you to plan for the future. It helps in learning. It helps you make better decisions in the future. And
it was seen as a good thing, right?
Yeah, that would be a good thing. But what a lot of research that I've conducted and many others have conducted is people do not learn from experience as quickly as you might expect them to. They actually tend to make the same decision over and over and over again, expecting to get a different result. And I just thought, after reading Harry Frankfurt's seminal paper on the subject of on bullshit in 1986, I couldn't find a better explanation. And it is his definition that I use in my own empirical research. This idea that when you communicate something with little to no regard for truth, genuine evidence, or established knowledge, that's when you're bullshitting.
So let's use that too, because I'm sure there's a question in most listeners' minds, and it's one that you often address, and that's the distinction between bullshitting and lying, because those are, I think it's easy for people to get those two confused. So help us understand that difference.
Yeah. So the liar, when someone lies to us, they're actually concerned with the truth. They are trying to get us to believe something that they don't actually believe themselves. Okay. But in the case of bullshitting, the bullshitter doesn't really care, doesn't have any interest, and is not paying any attention to truth, genuine evidence, or established knowledge. Okay, so the liar, again, is trying to communicate something that, as far as they know, is false, and they don't actually believe. But the bullshitter often does believe what it is that they are communicating. And it's not necessarily incorrect. So sometimes, just by chance, by accident, the bullshitter says something that's actually correct.
A broken clock is right twice a day phenomenon. Yeah.
Yes. But in those cases, if they're truly bullshitting and not lying, even the bullshitter wouldn't know that what they're saying is actually correct, because they're not paying any attention to truth, genuine evidence, or established knowledge. But there's also a very important social reaction difference to lying and bullshitting. So when people lie to us, we're not particularly happy with it, and there's probably going to be some consequences. At minimum, they've lost our trust, right, and our perceptions of their honesty is just gone. And so there are severe consequences for that. But when people bullshit us, we tend to kind of pass it off as like a mild social offense, and we assume that it's harmless. But that's where we can't be more wrong, is assuming that it's harmless.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to get to that, because I want to talk some about this idea of evidence-based thinking and some antidotes, or we'll get to some bullshit detection and sort of some of the things, some of the tools that you've identified. I want to take one kind of, I want to talk just a bit about the professional situation for you in terms of how this has gone down. Being in academia, it's not the most, it's a very serious, in general, a very serious profession. I don't mean that negatively. I meant it has a tendency to take itself very seriously, because it is. It's also known for, dense, difficult to follow language, oftentimes academics talking to other academics, not to the general public. So I'm curious the reaction to a serious line of empirical research based on the concept of bullshit. How is that? What's the faculty meeting like in that sense?
Yeah, it's funny. There was actually I started this work about 10 years ago, and I talked with some of my colleagues about it, and we share research all of the time. We sort of know what each other is doing, and among my colleagues, I had such wonderful support and interest in what I was doing. Okay. So it's always been wonderful. And they've always been, wow, he's studying bullshit. Right. But that's really interesting and great support. Now, outside of my colleagues, with the rest of the enterprise of academics and especially in psychology, most social psychologists, consumer psychology in business, communication sciences, even health psychology, they really did not know how to respond to what I was sending in my research to publish in the major journals within the field. And I had more desk rejections than I ever had. I only had one paper ever desk rejected before I started doing my bullshitting research.
Now, what does desk rejection mean,
so that means that the paper won't even be reviewed. Your manuscript is already without any review. They've rejected it.
They just looked at the title and said no go.
Pretty much. And I had only had one of those in my entire career. And it's funny that first desk rejection was then I later revised and added another study, and that paper is actually now published. So, but with my bullshit work, I've had such great difficulty getting it published, and I believe it's some of my best work, and it's of the same standards that I would have any other experimental work. But so there's been a little confusion as to like, well, what is it? And what am I trying to do? Am I trying to be cute, or am I trying to be intentionally provocative? And that's not it at all. I truly believe that bullshitting is perhaps our most pervasive social behavior there is, because by definition, it's almost impossible not to do. I mean, we cannot have well-informed opinions about everything.
Right. It's impossible. Yeah. Unless we stop talking, which we are not going to do. We are by definition, I mean, humans are both social animals and bullshitters by nature, I guess would be the corollary to that, correct?
Yes, absolutely. And it's almost like breathing, and you have to, if you want to be a factor in a social situation, or you don't want to be just a wallflower. At some point, somebody is going to expect you to share your opinion. And so we often feel, as social animals that we are, that we have to have an opinion about everything.
Right. Can't be, I don't know, or I'm not that interested in that. Like, I think about other things.
That's boring. So
right. Exactly.
That's just too boring. So people feel obligated to have an opinion about everything, but they know very well that it's impossible to have a well-informed opinion about everything.
Okay, so let's dive in a little. You've kind of given us a little bit of a taxonomy of bullshit, but let's maybe get a little more specific in terms of identifying bullshit. You mentioned them earlier, but what again are those key characteristics? How is it that you classify something as bullshit?
Yeah. So what I try to do is really tap into the motivations of the individual that is sharing a claim, whether it be verbal, written, email, whatever. So they make a claim about some reality, okay, or about the reasons for something, or reasons for attitudes that they have, or opinions that they have about something. And you really have to drill down was what is their motive? You know, when you said that a moment ago, Bryan, did you have did you honestly, truly have an interest in genuine evidence, truth, established knowledge? And if there's no motivation for it, then that's your textbook bullshitting.
All
Now
right.
that varies. Sometimes you have a little bit of interest and concern for it, but other times you have none. So there's a sort of a continuum of bullshit. When I ask most of my participants in my experiments, I say, would like you to tell me your opinion about capital punishment, or nuclear weapons, or why a student might be failing a course, or why prisoners, when they're released from prison, often return to crime. I mean, I can give them any issue. I ask, what's your attitude? What's your opinion about it? And then I ask, well, what are your reasons for your attitude and your opinions about the issue? And then they write their reasons, and then I give them the reasons back. And I said, well, when you wrote this, Bryan, how much were you truly concerned with genuine evidence, truth, established knowledge on a 0 to 10 scale? And you have to say genuine evidence. If you just say evidence, most people confuse that for explanation.
Right, or anecdotes. Right, yeah.
Yes. So, and usually what I get is a response of a 6. So they're a little bit above the midpoint. They're moderately concerned, right? So that then translates to a score of 4. And because bullshitting is the lack thereof of concern, right? So what I found in almost every study I've conducted is somewhere between 35 and 40% of what people communicate, that they are readily willing to report that about 35 to 40% of what they communicate is bullshit. Okay. So that's a lot.
Right.
Okay. That's more than a third, that's quite concerning. And it doesn't matter what issue. I've even used fictitious diseases that kind of sound real, that people could have no possible knowledge on it, but that doesn't stop them from writing about, well, how to prevent it and how to treat it and
Right.
and things like that. So, and this is well before, those studies are actually done well before COVID-19. So that's what you have to do. You have to drill that down.
Right.
And the best way to do that is to ask some questions about, once you've identified the claim. Once you've identified the claim, you have to ask, well, what exactly do you mean by that?
Right.
No,
a clarifying question.
A clarifying question. That's the easiest way to get people to clarify. And it's actually a wonderful antidote to bullshit, because it immediately reduces bullshit exposure, because what tends to happen is people will clarify and they say, oh, someone's interested. This person's interested in what I just said. And they'll tend to take a couple of steps backwards and start to clean it up, because now they know you're listening, right? And you're thinking, and you're interested. So they'll start to clean it up, and the clarification just starts to reduce it. But then if they can answer what exactly they're saying, then you have to ask, well, how do you know that is true? And it's important that you ask how. Because if you just ask, well, why do you think that? Usually what you'll get is a very abstract, heady, kind of theoretical kind of explanation for why.
Or some reference to authority or assumed authority from, well, I heard it from X, who I know to be knowledgeable.
Yes.
Right.
When you ask how, it starts a cognitive process that starts to elicit some sort of evidence listing if they have any at all. And it may be the very first time they've actually started to search for it.
Right, right.
And if you get through the how, then another good question is, well, have you considered any alternatives? Are there other things that you've considered? And if you get, even with these three questions, you get the answers to those three questions, you can make a pretty good assessment as to the motivations and the interest that the communicator is actually have in truth, genuine evidence, and established knowledge. And then you can make a decision as to whether or not you're
Right.
actually buying what it is what they're selling.
So with that, let's try to maybe go a little deeper. Can you give me a couple of examples of sort of bullshit in action, if you will, and bonus points for maybe business examples? I know you do a decent bit of consulting and speaking, so curious to know some relatable examples that our audience might relate to, either seeing themselves in the speaking role or in the receiving role, because we all want to think we're the only ones actually receiving this stuff, but we all have to be honest with ourselves and say that is not true. So
yes, well, there are several misconceptions and assumptions, I think, in the world of work, in the business place. And I think a lot of these ideas, a lot of these assumptions, they're coming from what I call the marketplace of business ideas. And it's a very lucrative marketplace. And there are many ideas that are continually going around that I think of them as dangerous half-truths. They're things like, the best organizations, they have the best people, and that financial incentives, they drive company performance. Strategy is destiny, or great leaders are always in control of their companies. Those types of things. Now, those types of beliefs, they often reveal assumptions that are not blanket truths, and they don't pass a logic test. And despite expensive consultants, they often fly in the face of some of our best evidence. Okay. And I think a really good example of this is a belief that Southland Corporation executives really bought into in the 1980s. They're the corporation that operates and franchises the 7-Eleven convenience stores. And in the late 1980s, they really bought into this idea of getting really close to the customer and kind of developing a customer satisfaction like obsession. And they pumped all kinds of money, millions of dollars, into a courtesy training program within their company. And they wanted to train all of their 7-Eleven store clerks to greet every customer with a greeting, a smile, eye contact, and a thank you, regardless of whether or not they bought anything from the store. And they pumped millions of dollars into the training and management bonuses. It was funny because even the whole thing at the end was capped off with a big event they called the Thanks a Million contest, where regional managers that had already won sort of regional courtesy campaign contests were eligible for a $1 million prize, a drawing. And Monty Hall, the game show host of Let's Make a Deal, did a media event on it, and a woman named Deborah Wilson from Plano, Texas, won the $1 million. Okay. Now, within 3 years, Southland Corporation had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Okay. And only after that point, people started to ask, well, the Thanks a Million contest was really a lot of fun, Bryan, but was it really worth it? Was the courtesy campaign, was it worth it? Did it drive sales? Did it influence all of the greetings, the smiles, the thank yous, and eye contact, and all of those things? But there was 15 stores. So this is where the experimental piece comes in. There were 15 stores that had escaped the training program, the courtesy training. And so it was decided, well, we're going to use these 15 stores to determine through a field experiment whether or not the training actually increased the courtesy measures and whether or not it drove sales. Okay. Again,
It was
these
like
are
a control group, basically.
yes, these are the types of questions that were asked only after everything had ended, right? So so what happened is that half of the stores were assigned to get the training, half of them were assigned not to receive the training. And then sure enough, within like 10 weeks, the smiles and the greetings, eye contact, and the thank yous, those all increased, but only from the stores that had received the training. What they did not expect to find was that the other half of the stores that hadn't received the training actually increased significantly their sales relative to the stores that had been trained. So it turned out that all of these courtesy measures only resulted in really long lines and a bunch of grouchy customers waiting too long to get their Diet Coke and their
Dips. Yeah.
fuel and get in and out of there. And it turned out that most 7-Eleven store customers, they equated high quality with quickness. All right. And this is
Speed. Right.
something that would have been really well, Southland Corporation really would have done well to find out from their customers, well, what did they define as high quality service before they launched all of this. So, but if you track this back, where did they even get the idea for all of this this customer service obsession? It came from the Southland executives' obsession and their infatuation with Peters and Waterman's classic book, In Search of Excellence, which recommended to managers to get really close to customers and develop this service obsession. That's where it all came from, but it hadn't been tested, and they just went with the assumption that what's worked in the past will work again for us. And
right. In other contexts, potentially.
That's right.
Right.
So
right.
it was completely untested before the decisions were actually made, and it turned out to be quite a terrible blunder for Southland Corporation. But it was all based on this simple idea that what we really need to do is just get have them have a nice, happy experience in the store. Some did, but again, it created long lines and grouchy people. But I think this is one of the reasons why Quick Trip convenience stores are doing so well these days, because their store clerks are actually they must be trained to operate very quickly. They're running like 2 registers at once, and they're getting people in and out of the store. But it's also in the name of the store,
right.
Quick Trip. So customers know what
it's not set up for you to linger, right? It's aligned with the customer's interest. They're stopping off of from wherever they're trying to get back on the road. Which, while it sounds like common sense, I mean, one thing we know about common sense is it's not always so common, right? I mean, that's a story in life that's pretty consistent. So, let's, one of the things that I think if I'm sitting in a chair listening to this, I'm thinking, okay, this is really interesting. What I'd love for John to help me build up my bullshit detection capabilities, right? And you just talked about some questions that I would say are general, right? They apply almost every circumstance. So let's go into maybe a few specifics as it relates to business. So what would be some specific tactics if you were, to employ, if you're someone who's a buyer inside an organization, you've got to buy goods or services from an outside company, and then we'll talk maybe a little bit as if you're a manager or hirer of people, so you're in the recruiting side, trying to bring somebody in. And then you're a decision maker trying to weigh different ideas from people within your own organization. So I gave you 3, I can always circle back, but let's start with the buyer role.
I think the approach would be the same for all 3, in fact. And in general, I think that probably the main thing that I would recommend is first understanding the difference between evidence and explanation. So if you are, a buyer and a seller is telling you we've got this new product that that is better and more effective than the old product, well, show me the evidence for that. Look and focus for any evidence for or against the claim is much more effective than hearing all of the explanation for why this is the new product, which is oftentimes just riddled with bullshit. So it's like, show me the genuine evidence as to why this is the case. And I give you a good example of that is when in the pharmaceuticals industry, most people don't realize that to have approval, of the FDA for a new drug, the drug does not need to be more effective than the earlier leading drug. Okay, they just need a single study to show that it's more effective than a placebo. Okay? And there's no limit to how many studies you can conduct. And the standard statistically today is that you have to show a difference between a placebo condition and the actual drug, and the likelihood that there's a difference that's just due to chance is less than 5%. So you need to show statistically that the likelihood is not greater than 5%, that the difference is not just due to chance. Okay. Now, most people don't realize this, but if I have a new drug I want to push and I run 100 studies, I've got enough money to run 100 studies. Well, then statistically, I'm probably going to have at least 5 studies that show that there's a statistically significant difference, right? And there's no limit to how many experiments I can run, right? So that's not strong evidence. That's just showing that it differs from a placebo. The control condition does not need to be the earlier drug. And so, but most people assume that, okay, new drug, new packaging, new name, it
Must be
might
better.
be better.
Right.
But it often is not. It often is not. It's just what's expected by consumers. Okay, there'll be new products that will always be better, but that's a major assumption that is often unchecked.
It can be true, but it's not always true, right? And in this case, structurally, the system isn't even set up to prove that, right? It's to prove against placebo, not against prior, let's say, a generic version of some drug that's gone to generic. So a manufacturer's come out with a new compound that you would assume is better than the old one, right? But that's not the standard that was used for approval. Doesn't mean that it's not, but it doesn't mean that it is either, right? To your point.
Exactly. And as the buyer, ask the seller, show me the evidence that suggests that this new product is better. As a person who is hiring someone, Bryan, you say that you can do X, Y, and Z, that you have these skills. Provide me the evidence that you are competent in these areas. That always is going to speak more loudly, having like genuine evidence for it, not just someone's opinion, but genuine evidence that you have these competencies. Okay.
Right.
And you mentioned, decision making, and kind of weighing alternatives. Again, the best way to make a decision is to find the genuine evidence that supports, all of the advantages and lack of disadvantages of a new option. And there is, within sales and marketing, sometimes these people are masters of kind of concealing the truth and kind of distracting and talking. That's why a lot of times they talk very fast. They give you a lot of information on it's almost impossible to even ask a question. And so you have to slow down the bullshit process a bit, and you have to ask questions.
Well, that's a strategy in and of itself.
Yes, yeah, it has to be slowed down, and you just the process of asking questions. Once you get the ball rolling on asking basic questions, people are usually, if they're listening, they're usually pretty good at asking more important follow-up questions, and then you can uncover like, well, how much real evidence is there? Because the fact of the matter is, there often really isn't much evidence for one idea over another, or one theory over another, and a lot of times it takes time to find that, and the best way to find it is through experimentation on your own, and looking at what others have experienced with either the new product or the new procedure or the new policy within an organization.
I think that speaks to the next question, and we're kind of coming closer to the end here to try to wrap up. But I had this idea in my mind of what are some really effective examples of bullshit detection strategies you've seen employed in the workplace or in the business environment. And I think it leads to this idea: where have you seen really good examples of experimentation done in a way that maybe they weren't explicitly trying to, detect bullshit or cut through the bullshit, but that's in essence what happened. Maybe a couple of examples in that regard.
Yes, I think two things, two very important things. One is to stop rewarding bullshit, and that what I mean by that is to start rewarding evidence-based reasoning, communication, and decision making. So when we reward bullshit, we just get more of it, right? And we give attention to it. If we legitimize it, or we make decisions in light of it, it's going to be very difficult to stop. But if we stop rewarding it and penalize it, and make reference to like we've made this decision because we believe this assumption, or we believe this idea, and it actually went nowhere because we actually kept an eye on some key objectives and key results since we made that decision, or we went with this new company, or whatever we did, and it led nowhere. And we've got the Excel spreadsheet to show it. So not relying on memory to kind of detect whether or not this was a useful, was a productive, idea that led to a desirable outcome.
Right.
But then the other one is, I think, to make it safe and secure within the workplace, within an organization, to voice a concern or to voice a problem. So many people use bullshit in the workplace. We found that people use bullshit in the workplace for at least 36 different reasons. And it often boils down to kind of promoting their own status or connecting with others. But one of the ways that they can promote their status is to take credit for everything that's going well, right? And to distance themselves from anything they don't want to be associated with, right, or viewed as responsible for, right? And so what you do is you often get a lot of people that are simply avoiding any association with any problems or concerns. They won't voice it. And I think one of the brilliant responses to this, I think comes from an example of a man that became CEO of Ford Motor Company in 2006, during a time in which things were not going very well at Ford Motor Company. But a man by the name of Alan Mulally became CEO, and one of the very first things that he did in the company was he instituted this mandatory meeting for executives. And in a mandatory meeting in the Thunderbird room, they had to report their status using a 3 color-coded kind of scheme. Green for everything is going very well in the company and or within my unit, and projects are going as planned. Yellow meant that there's a potential problem, and red indicated that there's definitely a problem and there's no immediate known solution. Now, it took a while. It took about 8 weeks for the executives to begin to trust the system, because as you can imagine, at Ford Motor Company, the bureaucratic and factionalistic culture that was in place for decades was still alive. And but what happened is, after the executives started to buy into this and say, okay, maybe yellow and red isn't so bad, because for the first 7 weeks,
everyone was green.
It was all green.
You weren't allowed to be
yes.
You were a bad manager if you weren't green,
yes.
right? That was the assumption, I'm sure.
Yes, but to Alan Mulally's credit, and he actually pretty much single-handedly saved Ford Motor Company at a very, very dismal kind of economic downturn at the time. He had the Thunderbird room in this executive meeting every week, every Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. He had the Thunderbird room lined with 30 additional chairs, and each executive was required to invite 2 guests to just observe the meeting. They weren't allowed to say anything or ask any questions during the meeting, but they just observed the meeting. And they were usually mid-level managers or factory workers or engineers. And after the meeting, Alan Mulally would ask each of the attendees what they thought of the meeting, and this is his way of modeling for everyone that a concern or a problem that would be voiced in the meeting, it wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. This is one of the only ways to replace sort of some of the incorrect, conventional wisdom that might be floating around as dangerous half truths, within an organization. And so he made this security and this safety of kind of allowing people to have a problem, because problems inevitably arise and concerns inevitably arise, but to make it okay and to not say, all right, not to kill the messenger,
Right.
but because then once the realities, okay, once the truth is revealed, then it's possible that everyone can work together to make to find a solution. And that's exactly what happened in the very first meeting, in which a man by the name of Mark Fields displayed the first red light in the eighth week of this executive meeting. That's exactly what happened. A lot of the other executives kind of came to, they kind of rose to the occasion, and they found a solution to the problem rather quickly. But they could only do that when they were dealing with the truth, and they weren't hiding behind bullshit reasoning and communication.
Well, I think that's a good one to kind of close on, and it leads me to my final question. So when you think about, I mean, some of the stats you gave us are somewhat sobering on the idea of bullshit. At least its ubiquity. But when you think about the current state of bullshit in the business world, are you optimistic or pessimistic about sort of how things are going? And in that context, what's the one piece of advice? I mean, you gave a sort of I think a good example from before. What's one piece of advice you'd give to any manager or business person if they feel like they're in a situation where, and we're knee deep in this stuff and I don't really know what to do?
Yeah, I think at least two parts. I would say one is to kind of attack the claims that emerge, and it's clearly bullshit. To attack the claims, not the individuals, because if you attack individuals, bullshitters, they'll probably shut down, and then that's the last time they're going to voice any kind of problem. And so to focus on the claim, why it might be incorrect or why it may only be partially correct, and then to model more evidence-based reasoning, evidence-based communication and decision making, to have ready-made evidence-based responses. So once you figure out the answers to some of those questions that I recommended for, the what, the how, and other alternatives, once you've found sort of some of the answers to that, to then model, well, I've thought about this other alternative, and it turns out there's actually quite a bit of evidence, A, B, C, D, for that, and maybe that's what we should be doing, in the future, as opposed to this sort of misinformed, misdirected bullshit that we've been using. Because quite a bit of bullshit actually comes from the most conventional management, techniques and beliefs. And when you actually look at the literature, most of those conventional management approaches just do not fit with the recommendations made by the existing literature.
Right.
So I think if you tap into the things that are like evidence-based, and you model that, then it's something that you can kind of model throughout the entire organization, like just as Alan Mulally did at Ford from 2006 to 2014, I believe. So,
yeah, I'm struck by some of the work that Dan Pink has done on both his book Drive and the book about sales. Forget about the broader context, but the idea of, you mentioned it early on, this idea of incentive pay or incentives writ large being the primary motivator of activity, in the way that business people have a tendency to believe we can structure incentives to get people to do exactly what we want them to. And the data don't seem to support that real well. They tend to have lots of unintended consequences, and it's a lot trickier to motivate people to do things a certain way, besides just change comp structures. But that's an easy thing to do. And so I think we have a tendency to fall into that trap.
Yes. Yeah. And I would, one thing I would add to that too, is I think kind of in addition to doing like reality tests and plausibility tests of new directions, I do think a rationality test is useful. It's kind of asking, like Simon Sinek's, famous question of like, start with why, and then answering like, well, well, why exactly are we doing this? Or are we doing this just because we need to do something and we should always be like, focusing on progress, or like why are we actually looking for a solution? Is there truly a problem? What's the motive
Right.
for the decision? I think that's an important question, even before any decision is actually made. I think it's an important thing to.
That's definitely fair. I think that's a good piece of advice for us to sort of end on. So I always like to wrap up with a little bit of kind of, I call them personal questions. They're not really personal, but they're not necessarily about the topic at hand. But I know you're busy, like a lot of us, and the school year's just started, so you're back at it in terms of the grind. But is there anything you've watched or read lately that you think others ought to check out?
Well, there's one of my favorite papers I've read just recently, fits with a lot of what we've been talking about. There's a paper called, they call it Tips from the Top. And it's called, Tips from the Top. Do the best performers really give the best advice? And it's a paper published by Daniel Gilbert and Timothy Wilson, two sort of, big names in social psychology.
Yeah, I've heard of Dan Gilbert for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. What they found fits entirely with what I've been really pushing lately. So most people believe that somebody who's been successful or somebody at the top gives the best advice. And so do the people at the top with power. They also think they give the best advice. And what they did, a very clever short experiment where they had people play a very simple word game. And then some of those people, they gave advice to future people who would then play the word game. And the top performers thought they gave the best advice, and the people who received advice, thinking they allegedly got it from the top performers, also thought the advice was good. But the advice actually didn't vary at all between the lowest and top performers, and it had no effect whatsoever on the subsequent performers in the word game. So there's this belief that a lot of the best advice just comes from the people who are most successful, and surely just by chance, some people are going to, even just by luck and chance, end up as the top performers. But it doesn't mean they provide the greatest advice. What it means to me is they often provide a lot of kind of retrospective explanations for why they did so well. And a lot of that is probably incorrect. A lot of it is.
They don't necessarily know why they were.
Bullshit. Yes.
Yeah, right. I mean,
so it's a great paper.
Tips from the Top. Okay, we'll link to it in the show notes so people can go check that out. So
yep, Tips from the Top.
Okay. So last question. Tell us about your first technology memory as a child. And it can't be like watching TV or using the phone. It's got to be something different than that. So.
Yeah, I think it's got to be my first Texas Instruments calculator that I still have, and it has my old home address on the sticker on the back of it. And I still only know how to do about 3 or 4 things on that, but I can find the cosine and find a couple of algebra answers and things on that. And now my daughter uses a Texas Instruments, and it looks, I don't even want to try. It's so souped up now. It's changed quite a bit over the.
Why do you think that memory sticks in your brain? What is it about that versus other things that why do you think you flagged that one mentally?
That's probably the beginning of my understanding of baseball statistics. And also,
I figured it had to be something relevant like that. Now we're getting somewhere.
Yeah, statistics go hand in hand with experimental social psychology. So I calculate statistics in the social sciences almost every day, and so it's something that most psychology majors don't expect. They think they've got the idea of Dr. Phil.
Right, more than clinical kind of sort of the couch metaphor.
Yes, but psychology is a science. It's a social science, and we rely on experimentation, and we test our ideas statistically. And so it's something that's carried me. But yeah, that would be my first. My interest in statistics would have to be baseball statistics and kind of figuring out ERAs and slugging percentages were rather
So
easy.
Pittsburgh, you had to be a Pirates fan. So were you part? Do you remember the We Are Family group? Were you the Willie Stargell and the Dave the Cobra?
Omar Marino
and
Rick Roden and
Kit the Colby, the closer, the sidearm closer. Yeah, they had the. I mean, no offense, but the ugliest uniforms of all time. So ugly that they were awesome.
They were pretty ugly.
Yeah, those mustard yellow, full yellow unis were pretty wild. That's very 70s.
Yeah, so. Yeah. Dave Parker and Bill Madlock, those guys.
Yep.
I love and Tony Pena. I love those guys. They were
Gotcha. Excellent. All right. Well, John, listen, thanks so much for the time. We really appreciate you joining us. I'll let you get back to work, cutting the bullshit for the rest of us, putting together taxonomies to help us figure out how to do better and leverage evidence where we can. So have a great day. Thanks again.
All right, Bryan. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, we'd appreciate it if you would become a subscriber wherever you get your podcasts. And if you could rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, that would really help us out. Or you can just go old school and tell your friends, your family, your colleagues, and hell, anybody else who you think might want to hear something like this to listen in. If you're on social media, make sure to follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @cuttheshit_pod. We are also on TikTok @cuttheshitpod, all one word, where we post lots of clips from the podcast. And last but not least, you can also watch the YouTube version of the show on our YouTube channel @Plow Networks. Until next time, take care and have a great day.